When it comes to emotional connections with someone who leans avoidant, confusion often becomes the first layer people experience because what you see on the surface rarely matches what is actually happening underneath. And this is where many people make the mistake of assuming disinterest when in reality the situation is far more complex, far more internal, and often far more conflicted than it appears. So before deciding whether to walk away or continue trying, it becomes essential to recognize that not all distance is a signal of absence, and not all silence is a sign of closure. Because in some cases, the very behavior that feels like rejection is actually the result of someone trying to regulate emotions that feel overwhelming to them rather than trying to remove you from their life entirely. And this is where the first signs begin to matter, not as guarantees, but as indicators that the connection may still be alive beneath the surface, even if it is not being expressed in a way that feels consistent or comforting. One of the most important realities to understand is that avoidant patterns are not simply about pushing people away for no reason, but often about managing closeness that triggers internal discomfort. And when that discomfort rises, withdrawal can appear suddenly, creating a gap that feels like emotional abandonment. Yet the presence of return patterns, even if delayed, suggests that the connection itself has not been completely discarded. And this is a critical distinction because it separates temporary self-protection from permanent disengagement, meaning that if there is still a pattern of re-engagement, even in small or subtle ways, it indicates that the emotional thread between both sides has not been fully severed, and this thread is what often keeps the possibility of continuation alive. Another key sign emerges in the way communication does not completely disappear, even if it becomes minimal or inconsistent, because when someone is entirely done, communication tends to stop without ambiguity, but when there are still moments of interaction, short replies, or periodic reappearances, it reflects an ongoing internal process rather than a finalized decision. And although these interactions may feel insufficient or frustrating, they often reveal that the person has not resolved their feelings completely, and unresolved emotions tend to resurface over time, especially when there is no new connection replacing the original one with equal or greater emotional significance, which means that the absence of closure can sometimes be an indication that the situation is still open-ended rather than concluded. It is also important to observe how avoidance behaves in relation to emotional intensity, because many avoidant individuals tend to move closer when things feel light and manageable, but pull back when the emotional depth increases beyond what they feel capable of handling. And this cycle of approach and retreat can create the impression of instability, but in reality, it reflects an internal threshold being reached, not necessarily a lack of interest. And when someone consistently returns after moments of distance, it suggests that the connection itself is still meaningful enough to draw them back, even if their coping mechanism prevents them from maintaining sustained closeness. And this pattern, while challenging, often signals attachment rather than detachment. There are also subtle behaviors that indicate ongoing awareness of the connection, even in the absence of direct communication, such as passive engagement through viewing content, indirect acknowledgement, or maintaining a presence in ways that do not require emotional exposure. And while these actions may seem small, they often represent a reluctance to fully disconnect, because complete disinterest typically leads to complete disengagement, whereas partial engagement reflects a boundary being maintained rather than a relationship being ended. And this distinction matters because it shows that the person is still positioned somewhere between involvement and withdrawal, rather than having made a final internal decision to move on completely. As the emotional landscape continues to unfold, one of the most telling signs is inconsistency, not in a chaotic sense, but in a pattern that fluctuates between closeness and distance over time, because consistency in detachment usually results in clear and predictable absence, while inconsistency often reflects unresolved internal conflict, where the person is navigating between the desire for connection and the need for independence. And when this tension exists, behavior tends to mirror it, creating cycles that can feel unpredictable but are actually driven by an internal struggle rather than external indifference. And recognizing this struggle can help reframe the experience from rejection to complexity, which is crucial when deciding whether to continue investing or to step back for clarity. At this stage, it becomes necessary to acknowledge that continuing to try is not simply about waiting or hoping, but about interpreting patterns correctly, because the presence of return, the maintenance of minimal contact, the persistence of subtle engagement, and the inconsistency in withdrawal all point toward a connection that has not reached a definitive endpoint. And while this does not guarantee future outcomes, it does suggest that the emotional bond still exists in some form, even if it is not currently expressed in a stable or fully accessible way. And understanding this allows you to approach the situation with awareness rather than assumption. The emotional weight of these signs often lies in their ambiguity, because they do not provide clear answers, but instead present signals that must be interpreted over time. And this is where patience and observation become more valuable than reaction, since reacting too quickly to withdrawal can disrupt the natural cycle that might otherwise lead to re-engagement, while observing patterns allows you to distinguish between temporary distancing and permanent disengagement. And this distinction is what ultimately determines whether continued effort is aligned with reality or based on hope alone. As the connection continues to evolve in this uncertain space, the most important thing to remember is that meaningful patterns are rarely built on single moments, but rather on repeated behaviors over time. And when those behaviors consistently show traces of return, awareness, and indirect connection, they often indicate that the door is not fully closed, even if it appears slightly ajar rather than wide open. And recognizing this subtle difference can completely change how the situation is perceived, shifting it from something that feels like loss into something that still holds potential, provided that both sides are willing and able to navigate the emotional complexity involved. Continuing from that point, the deeper layer of understanding begins to form when you realize that not every period of silence carries the same meaning, because in some situations, silence is used as a way to create distance for emotional regulation rather than as a signal of final disengagement. And this distinction becomes crucial when evaluating whether to continue investing your energy, since the absence of communication does not always reflect the absence of feeling, but may instead reflect the presence of internal processing that has not yet reached a point where it feels safe or manageable to express outwardly. And when this is the case, the connection often remains active beneath the surface, even if it is not visible in consistent actions, which means the emotional bond can still exist in a dormant or paused state rather than being completely dissolved. At the same time, another significant indicator lies in how responses occur when contact is reinitiated, because when someone is completely detached, responses tend to be either non-existent or purely functional without any emotional undertone. But when there is still warmth, curiosity, hesitation, or even slight emotional tension in their replies, it suggests that the connection still holds relevance within their internal world, and although they may not openly express attachment, their reactions can reveal that they have not fully detached from the emotional imprint of the relationship, which is often why interactions may feel inconsistent yet meaningful, because they carry traces of unresolved attachment that have not been fully processed or released. There is also a subtle but powerful sign in how someone behaves after periods of space, because space does not affect everyone in the same way. And in avoidant dynamics, distance can sometimes reduce emotional overwhelm, allowing the person to re-engage without feeling pressured. And when re-engagement happens more easily after space is given, it often indicates that the connection is still accessible to them under the right conditions, rather than being something they have permanently shut down. And this responsiveness to distance can suggest that the relationship still has a pathway forward, even if that pathway requires a different pacing or emotional approach than what was previously attempted. Another layer to consider is the presence of internal conflict, which often becomes visible through mixed signals, such as initiating contact and then withdrawing again, or showing interest followed by sudden withdrawal. Because these patterns are rarely random and usually reflect an ongoing struggle between the desire for closeness and the instinct to protect personal emotional boundaries. And when this conflict is present, It indicates that the person has not reached a point of final decision internally, but is still navigating their feelings, which means the situation remains open rather than concluded. And this openness is one of the strongest indicators that continued effort may still have meaning if approached with awareness and patience rather than urgency or pressure. It is equally important to recognize the difference between fading interest and protected interest, because fading interest tends to show a steady decline with no return, no curiosity, and no attempts to reconnect, while protected interest often shows hesitation, withdrawal, and re-engagement over time. And although both can appear similar on the surface during certain phases, their long-term patterns reveal very different trajectories, with protected interest maintaining intermittent connection despite distance, suggesting that the emotional relevance of the relationship has not been fully replaced or abandoned, even if it is not currently being expressed in a stable or consistent manner. As these patterns continue to unfold, one of the most emotionally challenging aspects is the uncertainty they create, because the lack of clarity can lead to overthinking, self-doubt, and attempts to interpret every small action as either progress or rejection. Yet the truth is that these situations often require stepping back from individual moments and focusing on the broader pattern over time, since it is the accumulation of behavior, not isolated incidents, that reveals the true direction of the connection. And when the broader pattern includes return, acknowledgement, inconsistency, and indirect engagement, it suggests that the connection still holds a place within the person's internal framework, even if that place is not fully expressed outwardly. At this stage, the emotional attachment on your side also becomes an important factor to acknowledge, because continuing to try is not only about observing the other person's behavior, but also about understanding your own boundaries, needs, and emotional capacity. Since maintaining a connection with someone who fluctuates between closeness and distance can be emotionally demanding, and while the signs may indicate that the connection is not fully closed, they also require you to evaluate whether the current dynamic is sustainable for you, not just whether it is possible to continue. There is a quiet but meaningful truth in situations like this, which is that potential alone is not enough to sustain a connection indefinitely, but potential combined with mutual willingness to grow, communicate, and adapt can create the conditions for something to evolve. And when the signs point toward ongoing engagement, unresolved feelings, and intermittent reconnection, it suggests that the situation still holds the possibility of development, even if that development is not immediate or straightforward. And recognizing this allows you to hold both awareness and realism at the same time. Ultimately, the decision to keep trying should not come from confusion or fear of losing something uncertain, but from a clear understanding of the patterns that are present. Because when the signs consistently show that the connection is not fully severed, that the person still re-engages in some form, that their behavior reflects internal conflict rather than final closure, and that there is still some level of emotional awareness directed toward the connection, it indicates that you are not dealing with a complete ending, but rather a dynamic that is still unfolding. And whether that unfolding leads to reconnection or distance depends on many factors, including timing, emotional readiness, and mutual effort. But the presence of these signs is what keeps the possibility alive, rather than eliminating it. In the end, what matters most is not just identifying whether you should keep trying, but understanding why the connection still feels present despite the distance. And when you can see that presence clearly reflected through patterns of return, inconsistency, subtle engagement, and unresolved emotional tension, you begin to realize that the situation is not as closed as it may have initially seemed, and that awareness alone can shift how you approach it, allowing you to move forward with clarity, emotional balance, and a deeper understanding of what is truly happening beneath the surface, rather than reacting solely to what is visible in the moment. Building on that understanding, the next layer to recognize is how emotional presence can still exist even when physical or verbal presence becomes limited, because in many avoidant dynamics, the expression of emotion is not always direct or openly communicated, yet it can still be observed through patterns of return, indirect acknowledgement, and subtle forms of engagement that do not require vulnerability at a high level. And when these patterns continue to appear over time, they suggest that the emotional connection has not been fully resolved internally, even if it is being managed externally through distance. And this creates a dynamic where the connection exists in a quieter form, not absent, but not fully accessible either. which is why it can feel like something is still there even when it is not being clearly shown. Another important aspect to understand is that avoidance often intensifies when emotional closeness reaches a certain threshold, and rather than signaling a lack of care, this reaction can indicate that the connection has reached a level of significance that triggers protective instincts, and when someone pulls back at moments of increased intimacy, it can actually mean that the emotional investment is real enough to feel overwhelming, which leads to withdrawal as a coping mechanism, rather than disengagement as a final decision. And when this cycle repeats, it often reflects an ongoing attachment that has not yet been fully integrated or stabilized, rather than a completed detachment from the relationship itself. There are also moments where inconsistency itself becomes a signal, not just in behavior, but in emotional availability, because when someone alternates between engaging and withdrawing, it suggests that they are not operating from a place of certainty, but rather from fluctuating internal states. And these fluctuations can be influenced by stress, perceived pressure, fear of losing independence, or difficulty processing emotional intensity. And when these internal variables are present, the relationship may continue to exist in a state of partial connection, where neither full closeness nor complete separation has been established. And this in-between state is often where continued effort may still have relevance, depending on how both sides navigate it. It is also worth paying attention to how they respond to emotional safety, because avoidant individuals tend to move closer when they feel that interaction is low pressure and non-demanding, and when interactions remain calm, respectful, and free from expectations, there is often a greater likelihood of re-engagement, which suggests that the connection is still accessible under conditions that do not trigger overwhelm. And this responsiveness to safety rather than pressure indicates that the bond has not been erased, but rather requires a specific environment to be expressed without resistance, which again reinforces the idea that the connection may still be active beneath the surface, even if it is not consistently visible. Another subtle sign lies in the way memories and shared experiences are treated, because when someone still references, revisits, or indirectly acknowledges past moments, it reflects that those experiences remain meaningful within their internal narrative, and meaningful memories are rarely associated with complete emotional detachment, since they continue to hold significance even if the person is not actively expressing that significance outwardly. And when these references appear, whether directly or indirectly, they often indicate that the connection has left a lasting imprint, which contributes to the ongoing presence of emotional relevance rather than a clean emotional break. As the situation continues to unfold, emotional ambiguity becomes one of the most challenging elements to navigate, because it creates space for hope, doubt, confusion, and reflection all at once. And in the absence of clear closure, the mind naturally tries to fill in the gaps by interpreting signals, analyzing behavior, and searching for meaning in patterns. But the key to understanding whether to keep trying lies not in isolated moments, but in the consistency of those patterns over time. Because when there is a repeated cycle of distance, followed by reconnection, even in small ways, it suggests that the connection has not reached a definitive conclusion and remains in a state of ongoing evolution rather than final resolution. At the same time, it is essential to acknowledge the emotional impact this kind of dynamic can have on you, because staying connected to someone who is inconsistent can lead to emotional fatigue if boundaries are not clearly understood. And while the presence of certain signs may indicate that the connection is still alive, it does not automatically mean that the dynamic is easy or stable, which is why awareness of your own emotional well-being becomes just as important as observing their behavior, since continuing to invest without balance can create internal strain even when the connection itself still exists in some form. There is also a deeper realization that comes with observing these patterns over time, which is that connections are not always linear, and not all relationships move forward in a straight and predictable way, especially when avoidance and emotional sensitivity are involved, because in such cases, progress may look like distance, pauses, reconnection, and recalibration, rather than constant forward movement. And understanding this helps shift expectations from rigid outcomes to a more flexible awareness of how emotional bonds can develop under varying conditions, allowing you to see the situation not as something broken, but as something that operates differently from more straightforward dynamics. In moments where uncertainty feels strongest, it can be helpful to return to the core indicators that suggest continued relevance. the presence of return after distance, the maintenance of some level of contact, the existence of inconsistency rather than finality, the subtle signs of awareness, and the absence of a clear and complete cutoff. Because when these elements are present together, they form a pattern that points toward an unresolved connection rather than a closed one. And recognizing this pattern allows you to ground your perspective in observable behavior instead of assumptions driven by temporary silence or emotional distance. Ultimately, continuing to try in such a situation is not about forcing something that is not there, but about recognizing when something still exists beneath the surface, even if it is not fully expressed in a consistent way, and when the signs collectively indicate that the connection is still being revisited, still being acknowledged in subtle forms, and still being maintained in some capacity. It suggests that the story is not over, but still in progress, and the direction it takes will depend on timing, emotional readiness, mutual understanding, and the ability of both sides to engage with the connection in a way that feels sustainable, balanced, and aligned with their respective emotional capacities. Continuing from that understanding, one of the most important things to recognize is that the presence of mixed signals is not automatically a reflection of a lack of care or absence of emotion. In avoidant dynamics, mixed signals often arise because the individual is attempting to balance the pull of connection with the push of self-protection. When someone pulls back after moments of closeness, it is often because the emotional intensity feels overwhelming, not because the attachment has disappeared. These oscillations, moving closer and then withdrawing, can be incredibly confusing, but they also carry a crucial message. The emotional bond is not gone, it is just being processed internally in a way that is not always visible. Understanding this allows you to see the difference between actual disinterest and protective distancing, which is essential if you are deciding whether to continue investing in the connection. Another key sign that the connection is still alive is the way the person responds after receiving space. Many avoidant individuals require distance to regulate emotions and maintain a sense of control. When space is respected and they choose to return, it is a strong indicator that they value the connection and are willing to engage on terms that feel safer for them. This does not mean that progress will be linear or immediate, but the act of returning after distance suggests that the bond remains meaningful enough to draw them back. The subtle difference here is critical. Absence or withdrawal can feel like rejection, but the choice to return demonstrates that the connection is still emotionally present, even if it is expressed cautiously. Observing the subtleties of engagement also reveals important clues. Even small interactions, like brief messages, indirect acknowledgments, or moments of shared humor, indicate that the emotional thread is still intact. In avoidant patterns, these gestures often appear minimal, yet they carry disproportionate significance. They are proof that attention is still directed toward the relationship, that the bond has not been completely severed, and that the person is keeping a mental and emotional space for you. While it may not feel substantial, it is these micro signs that over time reveal a pattern of ongoing relevance. Recognizing and valuing these small signals helps shift the focus from what is absent to what is still present, giving clarity to the decision of whether continued effort is warranted. Equally significant is the way internal conflict manifests in their behavior. Avoidant individuals often oscillate between approaching and withdrawing because of a tension between desire for connection and the need for independence. When you notice that they act on impulses to return after withdrawing, it is a reflection of unresolved emotional engagement rather than closure. This internal struggle means the connection still occupies space in their mind and heart, even if their actions seem inconsistent. Understanding that inconsistency often signifies internal conflict rather than indifference is critical because it reframes behavior that can feel frustrating into behavior that is informative. It tells you that the connection is not fully over and that continued thoughtful engagement may still be meaningful. Another telling sign is responsiveness to emotional safety. Avoidants tend to engage when they feel the environment is safe, non-demanding, and low pressure. When interactions occur in this context, and the person responds with warmth, curiosity, or even small displays of care, it indicates that the connection is accessible when conditions feel manageable. Conversely, pushing for intensity too soon often triggers withdrawal, which can be misinterpreted as disinterest. The key is to observe how they behave when emotional risk is minimized. If they show consistent, albeit measured, engagement under these conditions, it signals that the connection is still valued internally. This responsiveness demonstrates that the door is not closed and that patience and understanding of boundaries can create space for further development of the relationship. At this stage, one must also pay attention to how shared experiences and past memories are referenced. Avoidants rarely discard meaningful emotional experiences entirely, even when they struggle with intimacy in the present. When there are signs that memories, inside jokes, or shared milestones are being acknowledged, directly or indirectly, it signals that the emotional impact of the connection remains alive. These references reveal that they continue to carry the imprint of the relationship internally, which is another indicator that the connection has not reached a final endpoint. When combined with other signs like return after distance, subtle engagement, and responsiveness to emotional safety, the acknowledgement of past experiences strengthens the argument that continued effort may be meaningful because the emotional bond persists beneath the surface, rather than having been erased entirely. Recognizing these patterns also requires understanding the emotional weight of ambiguity, the uncertainty that arises from oscillating behavior. Partial engagement and indirect acknowledgement can be draining, yet it often holds crucial information about the state of the relationship. Instead of interpreting every pause or withdrawal as rejection, it is more productive to observe trends over time. Patterns that include return, intermittent contact, and ongoing engagement, no matter how subtle, suggest that the connection remains unresolved rather than concluded. This perspective allows you to differentiate between temporary absence and permanent closure, which is critical when deciding whether to continue investing emotionally. Another dimension to consider is the interplay between their behavior and your own boundaries. Recognizing that these dynamics are emotionally demanding is essential, because continuing to try without clarity or self-awareness can lead to burnout. Observing patterns of return and subtle engagement is only useful if you maintain a sense of your own emotional limits. Balancing patience with self-care ensures that continued effort is sustainable rather than reactive, and that your investment is conscious and grounded rather than impulsive or desperate. This balance is essential because even when the signs suggest the connection is alive, it will only be constructive if approached from a place of emotional stability and awareness. It is also necessary to consider the non-linear nature of progress in such relationships. Connections with avoidance rarely move in a straight line. Emotional closeness, withdrawal, return, and recalibration create a rhythm that may appear inconsistent, but reflects an internal process rather than external rejection. Recognizing this nonlinearity allows you to interpret behavior as part of a developmental pattern rather than a definitive endpoint. Patterns that repeat over time, even if unpredictable, often reveal the underlying trajectory of emotional engagement, and the ability to see these cycles as informative rather than punitive enables continued effort to be approached strategically rather than impulsively. Finally, the accumulation of these signs, return after distance, subtle engagement, acknowledgement of shared experiences, responsiveness to emotional safety, and behavioral inconsistency driven by internal conflict, creates a coherent picture of a connection that is unresolved rather than closed. Observing these patterns collectively provides the insight necessary to determine that continued effort may be meaningful. The presence of these patterns does not guarantee outcomes, but it does suggest that the emotional bond is still alive, and that with awareness, patience, and thoughtful engagement, the connection retains potential for further development and reconciliation, even if the path forward is slow, nuanced, and emotionally complex. This is the foundation on which the next decisions must be built, recognizing the difference between absence as protection versus absence as disinterest, valuing subtle forms of engagement as evidence of emotional relevance, and observing consistency within inconsistency to understand internal conflict. All of these elements combined form the roadmap for determining whether the relationship still holds space for growth, and whether your continued effort is rooted in reality rather than hope alone.